Woodworking is not a cheap activity, and I hate spending money. I want to share with you today a few tips, as well as my personal philosophy on how to make my money go the furthest, and especially to save money, but still enjoy my woodworking. Now, my personal philosophy when it comes to spending in woodworking is a three-headed monster. Minimize spending, maximize performance, minimize frustration. Those are all three key things to me. I find one of the things I hate the most when I am trying to enjoy woodworking is frustration. Now that may not seem like something you should consider, but I find it to be very important that my time in the shop goes smoothly and I enjoy it. So for me, I place a premium on having minimal frustration, and that's going to underpin a lot of these tips. Tip number one, whenever possible, resaw a board. You don't need a giant bandsaw to do this. You can do it on a table saw up to a certain size or a benchtop bandsaw. My table saw goes up blade height wise a little over 3 inches, but of course we can flip it around and do the double-sided trick to cut something closer to 6.5 inches. My bandsaw only goes up to 5 inches of resaw, but I use these all the time to maximize my wood. For anyone who's watched my channel for a bit, you know I'm obsessed with making boxes. I make tons of boxes. That means I need a ton of lids and a ton of bases, but those don't need to be particularly thick. For the base, 1/4 inch, a little over. For the lid, 5/16 to 3/8. I'm sure you can already see where this is headed. I buy a lot of rough lumber, meaning I often get it somewhere between 15/16 to an inch, something like that. It's obviously rough, I have to mill it, but I get a nice starting thickness. I make most of my bases out of Home Depot based pine, but it comes in 3/4, and I don't need that entire thickness. I hate spending money on planer blade replacements, so what I came up with is I'll buy a slightly wider piece, cut it down the middle, and resaw it open. That way I can get multiple bases out of a foot, 13, 14 inches of a board rather than planing off all the way through. And the upside is your bases will have a really cool book matched look. Whenever I've found a piece of base wood that I like at Home Depot, I will go through early on and I will just resaw and panel glue up quite a few of these. I have them sitting around for when I need them. You only need, I think I use 3 pipe clamps and then a couple F-style clamps to use cauls. I don't have a ton of clamps, but you can make them over time and stock them up, and it's a great way to take your wood an extra mile. Now, when it comes to the lids, like I said, I don't need a giant lid. 5/16 to 3/8 of an inch is good for me. All of these are from boards that were resawn in half. This guy, beautiful piece of spalted maple. It was probably that thick to start, maybe 8/4, a little over. I've already gotten 4 lids out of this, and I still have about 1 left in there. So I took an 8/4 piece of beautiful spalted maple, and I'll end up by the end getting about 5 lids out of it, one short there. Again, only on the table saw and the bandsaw. This is a little high or a little wide for the table saw, but what I'll do is I'll go as much as I can, full depth. I'll get the Japanese pull saw out and I'll go through the rest. So anytime you can, if you have the ability, means you have a table saw or a bandsaw, consider resawing your lumber if you don't need the full thickness, especially if you would otherwise have to plane it down. Planer blades are so expensive, and you can save so much mileage on them if you just limit the amount you have to plane by getting closer with a couple cuts on the table saw. When it comes to my tool purchases, I separate tools into core foundational tools and then kind of secondary tools. And I follow a buy once, cry once philosophy with the core foundational tools, and I'm more willing to spend less and accept some deficiencies in the secondary tools. Let me explain. I consider the table saw and the planer to both be 2 core tools, part of the big 6. Obviously, this is not my first table saw. I had 2 prior to this. But once I realized I really was into woodworking, I spent about 3 years saving up for this table saw, and I eventually got it. Along the way, there were times where I was tempted to get a grizzly cabinet saw or a Laguna or something like that, but I was patient because I said, I want a one and done buy once, cry once saw. I was willing to be patient and save up and get what I believe will be a forever table saw unless I win the lottery, in which I'm going to get bigger versions of this. The same thing when it came to the planer. I had to wait a while to get this, but I knew right away I wanted the nicest of the kind of reasonably priced lunchbox planers, and that seemed to be the 735. At the time, the Oliver wasn't out yet with the helical cutter head. That's fine. I still think this guy is king. Now, I don't really have room for a giant floor standing one, but for me, this is a core tool. So I waited and I said, I want the 735. I don't want to spend $200 less on a rigid and then sit there and want to get this eventually and then have to try and sell the rigid. So for me, core tools, buy once, cry once, ideally only once, but like I said, third table saw. However, for secondary tools, there's a little bit different of a trade-off here. The drill press and the dust collector are what I would consider secondary tools. Yes, you kind of need a way to collect dust, but you don't need a super expensive way to do it. I wanted to upgrade from a shop vac because it couldn't pull enough air for the cabinet saw, which I didn't think about ahead of time. So I got myself into a bit of a pickle, and I needed something slightly larger, or a little decent amount larger. But I don't need a perfect dust collector. I just need something good enough. Grizzly, perfect for me, right? About 600 some dollars. Does exactly what I need it to do. No, it's not a Rikon or Oneida or even the Rockler version that looks like this that's super expensive. Sure, it's got some little gaps of airflow in there. It's not perfect, but it's perfect for what I need and the price I wanted to spend. I was willing to go less on that. Instead of buying a name brand Cyclone, I went and got a small PowerTech kit and a trash bin, and I made one. It's not the greatest thing in the world, but it works pretty well. And for a combined total of, I don't know, $60 or less at the time, absolutely perfect for me. It's a secondary tool, and I'm willing to accept some compromises. The drill press. Honestly, I put the drill press off for years. Found out once I got it, actually I use this all the time. But I'm willing to make the trade-off that I can deal with a little extra run out, maybe some lack of fancy features. Hopefully it holds up over time. But at what was $200, that was a perfect secondary tool trade-off for me price-wise. I would rather spend the $200 on this so that I can spend more on something like the table saw or save up for something else in the future. I always like to try and save up in case I have to replace something. I like to keep extra set away. And for some people though, this may be a core tool. Not all of my core tools are going to be your core tools, but I like to separate them out, spend a little less on things like this and a little more on the table saw and the planer. One of the downsides with woodworking is there are a lot of consumables, saw blades, sandpaper, sanding discs, bandsaw blades, all of that. Things that we're going to use and eventually have to toss out. Maybe you can resharpen something a few times, but it's not going to last forever, or it's not going to last beyond a certain time period that we all kind of accept. And when it comes to consumables, I really like to focus on what is the performance per dollar and where can I spend less. So, for example, I think these 3M mesh Cubitron discs are simply much better than any alternative and the price is acceptable, so I buy the name brand. But when it comes to sanding sheets, I use some random Amazon brand. I use it for, well, everything except 150 grit. For some reason their 150 grit is absolutely terrible, so I still buy 3M in that case. But it's, I'd say, over half or less than half the price of the 3M for equal quantity, and I will continue using that unless it disappears. When it comes to saw blades, I occasionally treat myself and more for the testing out buy in a more expensive version like a Freud, but the Diablos they're the workhorse of the shop, and they're going to be the blades that I always buy when I need a blade, other than the occasional once every 2 years testing out something else. But I won't buy this blade again. I'll go back to the Diablo version. The price increase is simply not worth it. When it comes to that, performance of something like Diablo is high enough, and this is not higher enough to make the price trade-off. I'm willing to accept spending less on the Diablo than on the Freud and still getting 95% of their performance. Another example, bandsaw blades. I buy Olsen. They're kind of just like off-the-shelfish bandsaw blades. I've tried some more expensive ones because I'm always interested to know, is there a performance level that's so much higher or a longevity that's so much higher? And in the case of this, if you can get them resharpened, it becomes an interesting cost trade-off. But if you can't, then you're spending a lot of extra money for not many great reasons. But with these guys, bandsaw blades for a benchtop bandsaw can't be resharpened. I've tried numerous more expensive brands. I always come back to Olsen. I find that for the price to performance, it's just perfect. I don't need the expensive brand. For the consumable, I already bought the nicer of the benchtop bandsaws, but I can get away with the cheaper blades. And this is certainly one of the areas where the frustration factor comes in. I want to have decent cuts, so I'm not going to go any cheaper than Diablo. I've tried some cheaper blades. They were absolutely awful. I've definitely tried some cheaper bandsaw blades, lower in cost than the Olsen. Immediate no-no. They were incredibly frustrating. They didn't cut well. It was just a bad experience. So I could have gone even lower in price, but then my criteria of I don't want to be frustrated all the time when I'm using it came back in, and so I settled in the middle ground with something like an Olsen and Diablo. So that for me, like I said, frustration level is an important factor, but it's not the only factor. The next tip also involves consumables, and that's the size you buy. I find myself very attracted to the idea of the per ounce cost, right? Much lower when you buy a bigger quantity. But I learned probably within the first 2 years of woodworking that I often don't use all of it before it goes bad. I would have a bigger thing of glue and it would just go bad, or at least close enough to where it probably is bad that I didn't want to trust it anymore. After a while, I just said, look, I am losing money by wasting something. I'm going to buy a smaller size, use all of it, and I know for sure I've actually got all of my money's worth. And I've run the calculations on glue costs, and I do save money by buying these smaller ones compared to buying a big gallon and not using all of it. One of the biggest offenders is super glue. The bigger bottles, it always just hardens. It's impossible to keep the air out forever. So I buy these tiny little guys. They're a little more expensive, not too much more expensive, but what I know is I'm never gonna waste any. And that allows me to maximize the performance because I can still buy a decent brand of all of these, minimize the costs because I'm not wasting any, and minimize my frustration because, like I said, I'm still buying a decent performing consumable of something that can go bad. Now, the next one is not going to be for everyone, but if you live somewhere like I do where you get a lot of storms throughout the year and trees go down, or neighbors have a tree that a big limb falls off so they just want to fell the entire thing, well, that means within a relatively narrow radius, you've got a lot of lumber sitting there. However, you have to do the milling of it. About 3 years ago, I just gave a shot at milling it myself with this chainsaw. It's not particularly big, it's not the most powerful thing in the world. I would go and I'd get the logs that were, a little under 4 feet, something like that. It needed to be something I could literally carry. I'd bring them back, I'd set them outside, I'd prop them up a bit, and I'd just freehand it. I just went at it freehand. I get roughly board-shaped pieces of lumber, and then I sit there for the next month, and once every few days I take a hand plane and plane off some of the green wood until I get a board-shaped object. I then would let it dry some more, run it through the planer until it comes down to something looking like this. I then set it aside for about a year, track the weight once we get in there, and we get pretty close to usable lumber. Within a few more months, this is from last summer, this will be usable lumber. There aren't many other hobbies where you can build something from literally the tree itself all the way to the final box and not have to pay for the wood. Now, admittedly, there is labor time involved. They don't magically saw themselves apart. Gotta have gas. If you don't already have a chainsaw, well then that one's just out of the realm unless you buy a chainsaw. But I think this is an absolutely great way to get yourself some lumber, oftentimes a hardwood that's going to be something you would otherwise not buy because it's expensive. And then not only can you build a lot of projects, but I find that I don't feel as bad if something goes wrong when I'm using this lumber. I didn't pay for it. It was free labor and gas costs otherwise, but I can use it to experiment with things. I can use it for shop projects. And I just don't feel bad if it goes wrong, which is a really nice feeling. So if you own a chainsaw and you're in an area where there's trees that fall down from storms, or you see a neighbor who fells one, ask them if you can take a piece. Oftentimes they're happy to have you take some. Now don't take too much and get yourself in too deep. Obviously you have to dry it somewhere. I have probably 30 pieces of this sitting in a room over there. But if you take too much and then realize you actually have to put it somewhere, it can be a big problem. So I would start out by taking maybe 2 or 3 pieces that are 4 feet or under. If you're willing to give it a go, freehand with a chainsaw works great. If you want to buy some kind of chainsaw guide that's not too expensive, that can work as well. And that could be a one-time purchase that you even out over the course of years. This is elm. I had maple the last 2 years. And before that was one, it was also maple, but it was so figured. And I quarter saw on it. One of the benefits is you can saw these kind of however you want. So I've got some corner sawn elm in there, and I don't even know if anybody sells quarter sawn elm. I may be the only person in this whole zip code who's got quarter sawn elm, which I think is pretty cool. My next tip is be willing to kind of buy mid-tier if you're not 100% sure you need the absolute nicest version. For example, Narex chisels. I didn't have anything other than a cheap Home Depot set of chisels and I wanted something nicer. I could have spent $200 on a set, but I saw these Narex and I said, 60 bucks for 4 of them. I can find out whether I like them or not. I can find out how much I need chisels. I still have them and I probably will never buy anything better. These are great. A local Harbor Freight opened up around me. I have some Betsy clamps, but I hadn't bought any new clamps in years because they're absurdly expensive. But I went in there with like 40 bucks and I came out with a ton of clamps. They've performed great for me. And I know some people believe these won't last as long, and you're probably absolutely right. But until the point where I need so many of them to equal the same cost as a Bessey one, it's going to be better value. I don't need the nicest clamps. I have pipe clamps, not parallel clamps. Be willing, in certain cases, to kind of pick that middle ground, because you could still get really good performance like these Narex without having to spend the money on like a 2 Cherries or something like that. And you're going to be much happier in the long run that you get to have a tool and use it and figure out whether you like it. And maybe eventually in the future you can save up and buy a nicer version, but there's a pretty good chance you probably never will, because that middle ground version is often really nice. The final one on the list, and something commonly said, though I have a slight twist to it, is to buy used. Now for me, that's mostly hand tools. A lot of people buy used power tools. I don't know enough about motors and drives and all of that to be able to go to some sketchy house somewhere, have them turn on a motor, and immediately diagnose whether it's fine or whether it's something I need to fix, or what it even is that's fixable or not fixable, right? So I'm going to say buy used within your acceptable tolerances of knowledge, okay? Don't feel like you have to buy a used table saw if you simply don't know how to diagnose whether a table saw is absolutely running fine. I would not want to get myself into a scenario where I saved a couple $100, but then maybe a year down the road, I have to put a couple $100 into it to replace parts, or worst case scenario, something happens and it's just not fixable. With hand tools, you can often just do a visual inspection, meaning they're easier to buy online. You can look for rust pitting, you can look for cracks, all of that. Feel free to ask the seller if they have any more photos if you're not entirely sure. And you can save so much money and get some pretty darn good performance out of used hand tools. I'm not sure I ever really would have gotten into hand planes if there weren't cheaper used ones available. The upfront cost of a Wood River or a Lie-Nielsen, it's very intimidatingly high. And so for me, being able to get a used Stanley for like $70 a couple years ago, admittedly, was a huge entryway. I did a little research. I said, what do I need to look for? Once I had figured that out, I went and I looked at all the photos online, and I got a great hand plane I've been using for multiple years now. But if you're like me, don't feel bad if you don't know enough about power tools to be able to buy a used power tool and be confident that it's going to work and you're not going to waste money. I also wanted to say, if any of you work for MGM Studios, I know you're looking for a new James Bond. And while I don't have a British accent, I am cheap, so I can save you a ton of money. I will work for like $20 an hour, whatever you want. I've already got the movement down. So think about it. All right, thanks for joining me today, guys. Have a good one. And if you've got any tips, please leave them below. I would love to save more money. Bye.